Now, the ANC has kicked off their 112th birthday celebrations, visiting churches in Mbombela, that's in Mpumalanga. In fact, the party leadership sent members to various churches across the province to ask for prayers. Deputy President Paul Mashatile went to several Mpumalanga churches, including the Mighty Wind Ministries in Barberton. As we build up to the elections this year, we take a look at the relationship between politics and religion. And for that, let's bring in our guest. David Jeffery-Schwikkard is a PhD candidate in theology and religious studies with King's College London and joins us now via our video link. David, it's lovely to have you on the program. Thanks very much indeed for helping us think through what can be a very complex issue. And as a start, I think it's safe to say that the relationship between religion and politics possibly dates all the way back to Jesus' time in Christianity, right? Jesus himself was seen as a contentious political figure. So for people who are being critical of the ANC using churches for political expediency, are they being fair?
Thanks, Yanda, and good morning to your viewers. I think there are two things that people are normally worried about when they see politicians going to church. The first is that they worry that politicians will then pursue laws motivated by religion. But I think South Africa is actually a very good example of how this isn't the case. We have, as a country, a very religious electorate, and yet our state is very secular. And the ANC's relationship to churches, as you mentioned, is long-standing. And so I don't think there's a real risk that when we see the ANC going to churches, we should be seeing religious legislation. I think the ANC has historically maintained a close relationship to churches on the one hand, and yet still pursued very secular laws.
Yeah.
The second thing that people are often worried about is that voters will be influenced by politicians in churches, that they'll see a politician in church and then want to vote for them. And I think that does voters a disservice. So as part of my research, I'm often in churches where politicians are visiting. I speak to the congregants next to me, and without fail, the people who I speak to, like every voter in South Africa, engages very critically with politicians and what the politician is saying. And so I don't think it's as simple as a easily swayed voter in a pew.
That's interesting because, you know, messaging is important in politics as it is in religion, right? What you say when you're on the pulpit is probably your currency. And in many instances, there is a concern that politicians who, let's face it, go to these churches at strategic points of a political cycle. There's concerns that those are politicians who are hoping to co-opt the message of religion and in some way use that, for instance, to drive any kind of support that they're hoping to get.
Yes, so I think this tells us something important about how the ANC sees itself as a political organization. One part of this, which is very important, is that the ANC sees itself as a leader of society, and so in visiting churches, it's part of this partnership with an important actor. And then the second is that it sees itself as a people's movement, and so it's important to politicians within the ANC, for example, that they are alongside the people that they hope to represent. And so I think what we see heading up to an election time is an intensification of those efforts and definitely more media coverage of those efforts. But I think throughout the year, ANC members, ordinary members, are attending church regularly. The ANC as an organization has a membership that is largely very religious.
Of course, throughout the year, they're attending just as ordinary congregants, right? They're not really there as, for instance, the second Deputy Secretary General of the party. But I think your point is still well made. What's the responsibility of church leaders in these instances, though? Because the church itself also has some kind of role to play, right? And we've seen the kind of impact it's had, for instance, in our attempts to get democracy as a very clear moral voice. It's difficult to reconcile that with church leaders potentially allowing people who aren't the greatest sign of morality.
Yes, I think that's a very important point. I think church leaders, as with any leader in civil society, have got an important role in criticizing government, especially criticizing immoral practices in government. I think also religious leaders need to be very careful in associating too closely with politicians, precisely because their congregants engage very critically with politicians. And so there's always a risk of dividing your congregation as a church leader. I think politicians, for better or for worse, are among the least trusted people in South Africa. And so religious leaders need to think very carefully about being associated with them.
Yeah. For people who are hoping for a kind of clinical cut between religion and politics, I wonder if you reckon, given your own studies, whether that's even possible. From the time of the Roman Empire, we've seen how, quite frankly, religion has very much been a political endeavor, in a way, if you know what I mean. And so for people who are thinking, even in an election year or any other year, that we should be able to have this distinct cut between the two, I wonder how possible you reckon that is.
Sure. So just to note, I think the relationship between religion and politics predates Christianity. Right. But I think on your point about whether the split is possible, I think there's another question as to whether it's desirable, in that the status quo we have in South Africa at the moment is we somehow have managed to maintain having a very religious electorate and yet having very secular laws. So, for example, we were one of the first countries to recognize same-sex marriages legally, and we have one of the most liberal policies on abortion in Africa. And so I think, considering that this is our status quo in South Africa, we need to ask how that is maintained. And I think one way that is maintained is that politicians, even while they pursue secular legislation, are still very happy to engage religious voters where they are, in church. I don't think that's necessarily a thing.
That's very interesting, because there's people who, for instance, take umbrage with the fact that South Africa's national anthem is a prayer, right? Nkosi Sikelel' iAfrika is an appeal to God. And in some ways, it's kind of this unofficial expectation that we'll all rally behind it, even for people who don't resonate with the religious aspect of the national anthem.
Yes, which is a good example, I think, where you have something like Nkosi Sikelel', which does have religious lyrics, but one that is embraced by almost all South Africans, whether religious or not. I think this is a good example of the ways in which religion can be integrated into the country in an inclusive way.
Sure, very interesting indeed. Well, I suppose the final question I have to ask is whether or not, as a political strategy, you reckon going to these churches actually works, right? I mean, part of the sentiment you've expressed is that people who are sitting in kind of the pews, for lack of a better term, aren't necessarily swayed just because you're in a place of their refuge. They're still very critical about who you are, what you represent, and possibly what you say whilst you're there.
Yes, so I think it probably is a very effective political strategy, especially in a country where very few people are on social media. A voter, I think, is much more likely to trust a politician who's met them where they are, rather than only address them through rallies or speeches on the TV or online. And I think this is actually an edge that the ANC has over other political parties, which don't really engage with churches in this way. I think it makes the ANC much more approachable as an organization.
Fascinating, interesting, and insightful. David Jeffery-Schwikkard, thanks very much indeed for speaking to us. I appreciate your time on the AM Report. David is a PhD candidate in theology and religious studies at King's College London. Once again, thanks very much indeed.